Welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, U.S. of A. This is the first episode of 6. We're going to examine this amazing remnant of penal history, Eastern State. Now, let me pause on this image for a moment to explain the complexity of what we're going to talk about in this series of commentaries. Now, this is obviously a blueprint from John de Havilland, who is a very intriguing architect. He's an English immigrant to the U.S. He studied with the best prison architects in England and then imported a lot of his architectural influences into the American prison culture. And I say prison culture, not so much inmates, but with commissions, with politicians, reaching all the way up to President Jackson in the 1820s and the 1830s. And what we see here is a lot of information. So, for example, this blueprint appears to be symmetrical, but obviously to the learned eye, it is not. It appears to be lopsided to the left. And originally, the design emanated from the right-hand side. And that's where you see these cell blocks that appear to be much more consistent in layout, in floor plan. But what happened, as soon as Eastern State was being built by its own prisoners, it fulfilled the prophecy of prison expansion, which is as soon as you build a prison, or even before you finished it, it's already full. They're already sentencing convicts to this institution. So in order to accommodate this influx of prisoners, the Commission of Prisons in Pennsylvania and the Commonwealth ordered the expansion of Eastern State to stack on an additional tier. Originally, this was a single tier. We're going to see evidence of that in the photographs we're going to see today. But you also have to realize that they are now double tiering the design. Obviously to the frustration of the architect, Havilland, because architects go to great lengths designing with a blueprint, anticipating its grand design, its vision. Architecture is important because it sets the record straight. And I'm going to comment on the importance of architecture throughout these episodes, but I'm bringing it to the forefront at this stage so that you recognize its cultural importance in the larger confines of prison studies. Let me also expand the view of what we're looking at here, the facade. Now, you could get into a food fight between which prison design was more influential, the American design by way of Havilland or Pentonville in London. There's not a lot of creativity in prison design when you go around the world. I've studied prisons in South Africa, South Korea, Argentina, the list goes on. But what is important here is that both of these paradigms, the English and the American, are very much intertwined. And given that Havilland studied prison architecture, in England, it's important to realize that he's, again, borrowing a lot of those designs and a lot of those traditions. But let me jump ahead to the facade here, which is neo-Gothic. It has a fortress facade, and this was designed for the absorption of the people who lived in Philadelphia at that time, who were European immigrants, and they could recognize the significance of the fortress design. It's perhaps imprinted in European people from that era who recognized the grand power of Gothic and Neo-Gothic architecture. It speaks to power, it speaks to authority. But the prisoners were not able to see this architecture for a few reasons. One is the facade was designed to be viewed from outside, not from the inside. And secondarily, the prisoners were blindfolded in the early phases of this prison. We're going to talk more about that because that stems from the Quaker philosophy of punishment and reform. But what I want to point out here with the cursor is this is the French language. Eastern State Prison is written in French. This speaks to its international status. Prison commissioners, prison wardens, prison designers from all over the world traveled to Philadelphia to tour Eastern State. Let's go to the next image and I can comment further. But this is before I leave this image, let me point out that this is actually a design, an emblem, a logo, an insignia that is printed on a book bag that you can buy at the gift shop. So we have elements of commercialism embedded in this overall prison tourism. More about that later. Now we see an image, a lithograph in the 1850s. This gives you an idea of how it quickly evolved from the 1920s and 30s. By the 1950s, again, you can see that Eastern State is still located in a relatively rural area of Philadelphia, and city center is very close. You take a taxi from the city center to Eastern State, if it takes you 12 minutes, even with moderate traffic, well, it's a long journey. But let's examine a few of these features. We see the facade. I'm pointing out with the cursor here. This is the Fairmont. This is the Avenue. Okay? And you see the design that Haviland put into place, which is the spoke and the hub. The radial design. The radial design. Here's the hub, the central control center. We're going to see a lot of that in the next few episodes. And we see the tiers fanning out from the central hub. This is panoptic. It's not a panopticon in the traditional sense, but it is panoptic. It's designed to enhance visibility of the population confined to the institution. and a more modern shot. Now you see the city of Philadelphia expanding, surrounding the compound. The angle that we're looking at is a little bit from behind because this is the facade. This is facing the avenue. And this is what it looked like when it was in operation as a fully functioning American penitentiary, Eastern State. This is what a prisoner would see from the inside in the period when they allowed prisoners to congregate in the yard without being blindfolded. That system of confining prisoners with blindfolds was abandoned after decades of experimentation, known as the Pennsylvania system. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go to the next panel. From the standpoint of architecture, I want you to recognize retrofitting, and that is attaching architectural features to an existing design for purposes of expanding and improvising its form and function. Let's take a pause and come back with more of those observations.